Welcome to But Jesus Drank Wine.
And other stories that kept us stuck. I'm Mead.
And I'm Christy.
And in this podcast, we'll explore the stories that kept us, well, stuck, wanting to drink and not wanting to drink all at the same time.
Join us as we show you that freedom from alcohol does not have to mean a life sentence of misery and missing out,
but actually means living an authentic life full of peace, joy, and purpose.
Hello, my beautiful friend. It's Christy here. Just quickly wanted to pop on here and let you know that my book, Love Life Sober, a 40-day alcohol fast, is now available for order. I will stick a link for you in the show notes. But if you want to head to lovelifesober40dayfast.com, you can get it there on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, pretty much everywhere. I'm really, really thrilled to share this with you, and I cannot wait for you to read it. Thanks.
Happy Monday, friends.
Hello, everyone. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Lee Warren. You have so many fans in our community.
We are so excited to welcome Dr. Lee Warren to the podcast today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Warren. Yeah, I was going to say Dr. Lee. Okay, I was going to say Dr. Lee, Dr. Warren. Okay, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to chat with you. For those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Lee Warren's work, he is a brain surgeon, an inventor, Iraq war veteran, and author of several books, including I've Seen the End of You, a neurosurgeon's look at faith, doubt, and the things we think we know. Also, No Place to Hide, which was named to the 2015 U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff's recommended reading list. And the book I found him through, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Dr. Warren has appeared on the 700 Club, the CBS Evening News, and his writings have been featured in Guidepost magazine. Dr. Warren practices neurosurgery at Great Plains Health. He plays the guitar and loves to make connections between faith, science, and the realities of life. Dr. Warren lives in Nebraska with his wife, Lisa, and we're just so grateful that you're here. So thank you for joining us today. First, I just also want to say thank you for your service. I grew up in a military area, and although we were not in the military, my family wasn't in the military, we just have so much respect and appreciation for the sacrifice of servicemen and women and the sacrifice of their families. We saw that firsthand growing up where I grew up. So thank you for your service.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here with you both, Christy and Mead, and shout out to our mutual friend, Caroline Beidler, for introducing all of us. And it's where I first heard about both of you. So I'm glad to be here.
So I found your book, Hope is the First Dose, through not in this space, but because it was what everybody at church, the pastors, it was spreading like wildfire when it came out. I guess it was last year, wasn't it, when it came?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was spreading like wildfire. Everybody was talking about it. And so I jumped into it, and I read a lot of books, and I don't often go read them all the way to the end. That's just a little known fact about me. And I rarely read something a second time. I finished your book and I've gone through it a second time. It's such a gift. It's so powerful. And the way that you write and tell the story and welcome us into the pain of losing your son, Mitch, and the hope that became the thing that kept you going in that time it's such a gift. And so I thank you for that work. And we'd love to just start with how you got into writing and podcasting and all of those things. And now as a ministry leader, because this was not probably something you had on your bingo card,
That's right.
This wasn't on our bingo card all those years ago. Would you give our listeners a little background on you?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, I was in the military, I was in the Air Force, and went to the Iraq War. And the backstory, if you haven't read my first book, No Place to Hide, is that when I left for the war, I was in the midst of the failing of my first marriage. It's been 16 years. And basically, while going off to war, I had been at war in my personal life for a long time. So I ended up getting a divorce while I was deployed and came home from the war with a lot of work to do, try to figure out how to put my relationship with my kids together, and moved from Texas to Alabama, where they had moved while I was deployed, and tried to figure out what my life was going to look like going forward. And so I didn't have time to process the fact that I had been mortared 100 times and done 200 brain surgeries and held hands with privates while they bled out and died and all that stuff from war. I literally put all my stuff in a trunk in the garage of my house and just left it there and never dealt with. So I got busy in my life, started to practice, got out of the Air Force, ended up later putting my family together, marrying Lisa, getting back on my feet, finding my faith, all that stuff. And then 5 years later, after the war, had my first encounter with PTSD. Random helicopter flew by one day, and I just went crazy. All that stuff came out of me, and so it was in the processing of the repressed trauma of having been to war and gone through all that. I was struggling and trying to figure out what was happening in my brain. Even though I was a neurosurgeon, I didn't understand what was happening in my trauma response. And Lisa said, "Hey, you ought to go out and unpack that trunk and tell us the stories. You haven't told me and the kids any of that stuff that happened to you, you've been through. You ought to talk about it. You ought to write about it." And I said, "I don't want to do that." So I didn't. And I kept having nightmares and I kept having trouble. And so I went to the hospital and bumped into a friend who was a psychiatrist. And I said, "Hey, theoretically, I had a friend who's going through all this and had this trunk in the garage and went through PTSD and all that stuff. What would you tell him he should do?" And he said, "Oh, he should write about it. Unpack it, go out in the garage and tell the stories." And exactly what Lisa had said. So I did it. And Lisa and I went out there and we unpacked that trunk and I found the shrapnel I'd taken out of some guy's brain and told her the story about it. And I found a thumb drive that had all the pictures I'd taken and that had been taken of surgeries that we did and all that. And on one of those files, we almost never knew the names of the soldiers we were operating on because it was so quick. They'd come off the helicopter, operate on them, stabilize them, put them on a plane, get them back to the States. And we never knew they lived or died or what happened to them, except the ones that died there. So we didn't know anything about really what had happened. So we had all these unresolved stories. I did this big case and did this big thing and got the guy through the operation. Did he live or die? I don't know. Did my work matter? I don't know. Did I make a difference for anybody? I didn't know. But there was one file, guys, on that thumb drive that had a name attached to it, Sergeant Paul Stansfield. I still don't know why that guy's name was on that file. But Lisa said, "I wonder what happened. Did he survive?" And I said, "I don't think so. That was the worst injury I've ever seen. It was this guy that got an IED blew up close to him and had major injuries to his carotid artery and jugular vein. His whole left side of his head was missing. Like terrible traumatic injury. 5 surgeons operated on him at once to try to save him." And we Googled his name, and there he stood on the CBS Evening News being interviewed about how he had recovered from these wartime injuries. And he was normal, like he was talking. And so we reached out and found him, and we flew to Pittsburgh, and I met him and hugged him, and we talked to each other, and it just healed this thing in my life. And so I wrote a book about that. My first book, No Place to Hide, was that story, like just unpacking all that stuff. And it was to try to process what had happened and the trauma that I'd been through and all that. And at the same time, while I was dealing with all that, I was dealing with the problem professionally. And as a Christian who's also a neurosurgeon, I was having a problem when I saw a patient and I'd look at their MRI and I would see a malignant brain tumor called glioblastoma. It's the most common brain tumor, and basically nobody survives it. And so I would see the scan and I would say to myself, I've seen the end of you. I know what's going to happen to you. I know when you're going to die. I know what's going to happen. I know what surgery is going to look like. I know what I'm going to tell your wife. And I just would see all that stuff. And then my Christian mind would say, wait, you're supposed to pray and have faith and have hope and all this stuff, but you already think of the outcome. And how are you supposed to doctor people when you can't save them and all that kind of stuff? And so I was writing a book about that, about how do people handle hardship and how do you hold on to hope and faith and all of that stuff. And I was in the middle of writing that book when Mitch died, my son. So I was becoming an expert on helping people process trauma and pain when I became a person who was processing trauma and pain again. And so in the midst of losing our son a few months after he died, I started writing to my children every day to try to give them some good news or something to hold on to. And they started sharing it with people. And it eventually that sort of daily kind of hope message turned into a blog, and that turned into the podcast, and that became shared around the world. And that's what now is my self-brain surgery newsletter that goes out every day, every Sunday. It has been every Sunday since 2014. So all of this work that we're doing right now together came out of those pain points of life. And I think Lisa and I sat down at some point and said, so around the time that we decided to make a podcast out of it, it was, we were getting people reaching out to me and to her saying, we're going through something like you've gone through, but we don't have the words to understand it. And your work is helping us make it through. Your work is helping us process what we're feeling. And so we realized that there's this verse in Luke 12:48 that says, much to whom much is given, much is required. And I'd always taken that on the positive side. You get all these blessings, you're expected to give back and all that. And we realized it means even your suffering. If God puts you through something and equips you to handle it, then there's going to be somebody around you who's not equipped to handle it. And you're required to help them. And so that became this work that we're doing is another part of my medical practice. I can operate on somebody in the operating room, or I can help somebody find out what's hurting them and what to do about it with my words. And so it became missional that I'm practicing in a way that helps me write, and I'm writing in a way that helps me practice. And it just all came together that this is my bigger calling, is helping people understand what's hurting and what to do about it.
Wow. So good. I love that you mentioned like that curiosity of like, how does being a Christian and what we believe to be true of the Bible, and how does that fit together with the science? Because that's what largely led me to being in this place now where I'm free from alcohol and have been for 5 years, and being able to connect those dots, because I knew they went together. I just couldn't figure out how. And so I'm so grateful for your work, and the work of Dr. Kurt Thompson was instrumental for me in being able to piece all this together. And I think it's so powerful for being able to help people. As you say, we say, change your thinking to change your drinking. As you would say, change your mind, change your life. And with the underpinning of Romans 12:2, renewing your mind and take your thoughts captive, 2 Corinthians 10:5. So we have those foundational elements in common with the work that we teach people about. I'm curious if you could expand on your self-brain surgery for the listener that isn't familiar, because your way of being able to access how we can change our thinking and how that changes everything else. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. I don't know if we have 2 hours.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Just a bit.
I gave a 2-hour workshop 2 weeks ago. Max Lucado invited me down to his church in San Antonio, and he did an 11-week sermon series called Think About What You Think About.
Ooh.
And they wanted to do the neuroscience piece at the end, and they asked me to come do it. And they said, you got 2 hours, teach this stuff for 2 hours. And so the punchline is that right after Mitch died, Lisa and I were practicing in Alabama at the time, and she ran our office. We worked together every day. And our office was on the 3rd floor of an MRI research facility at Auburn University when we lived in Alabama at the time. So War Eagle, if there's any Auburn fans out there. But we were in this building where they were doing what they called functional MRI research. And functional imaging is different than an X-ray. When you go get an X-ray of your arm, you can see the bones. You see the structure of the thing that you're taking a picture of. That's a normal X-ray. But functional imaging, you can see what the organ is doing when you look at it. So you could image the heart and see what's happening electrically in the heart. Image the brain, you can see what's happening when somebody moves their arm or thinks about something. So we had lost our son, and after about a month, we realized that if we didn't go back to work, like we were going to lose our business. We had 10 employees, and if you got a back problem or a brain tumor or something, you're not going to wait a long time for the surgeon to come back from bereavement leave. You're going to go find somebody else to take care of us. So at some point we realized we got to go back to work. We didn't feel like it, but we had to. And so a few days after we went back, there was this meeting down in the MRI center that we'd been invited to. We were like, okay, we'll go. We didn't feel like it. But in that meeting, we got to watch somebody in the scanner, and we got to watch them. They took all these questionnaires of the people and would say, okay, Meade, what's the worst thing you've ever been through? And what's the best thing you've ever been to? And Christy, what are your dreams and hopes and fears and all that stuff? They had all this data on these people, and they put them in the scanner, and they would say, okay, Mrs. Jones, think about that worst moment you've ever had. Think about the day your husband died or the day your child was stillborn or whatever it was, that terrible thing that happened. And you got the DUI and you lost everything. Like what happened? Think about that. And you would see on the screen the areas of the brain involved in processing that bad memory light up. And what lighting up means is that there was increased blood flow to that area, which means that the brain was more metabolically active in that area, which then is a proxy for the brain's doing something in that area that's related to fear or anxiety or whatever. So there's something structural happening inside the brain. And in the neuroscience community, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my voice.
Okay.
In the neuroscience community for 100 years before about 1999, the belief was that your mind is generated by your brain. It basically, mind is a construct of the activity of the neurons in your head, right? So that when you think of yourself or you think of your consciousness, it's really just the activity of neurons that's making you think that you can think, and that you're basically just generated by the activity of your brain. And so that led to a doctrine called reductionism, which means basically, and it started with Isaac Newton 300 years ago, but basically if you could tear something down to its parts, then you could put it back together in a way that understanding how it's built, you could determine how it's going to function. And so essentially neuroscience latched onto that, especially since 1953 with Watson and Crick and DNA explained. Everybody got this idea that the genes we inherit and the way our brain is formed turns out to be all encompassing of who we're going to be. How you think and how you feel and how you react and what you decide and who you marry and all that stuff is basically the product of your genes and your DNA and your neurons, right? And so that's what we all thought until about, or at least neuroscience all thought until about 2000. And the secondary thing that we were all taught is that you were born with mostly all the brain cells you were ever going to have, and that those brain cells were pretty much hardwired together to create the way that your brain was going to work. So you are just your brain, and you are stuck with the brain that you have. Those were the two big mantras of neuroscience. But what happened in the late 1990s, they discovered that the human adult brain actually does make new nerve cells. Every day you make new neurons. And then they discovered that those neurons break and reconnect to each other in a process they call making synapses all the time. Like literally every second. Since we started talking, you've made hundreds of millions of synaptic connections between neurons. The problem is they keep making themselves in the same way over and over unless something makes them change. So then the theory became, if you go through a certain kind of trauma or something bad happens to you, or you encounter some kind of adverse situation in your life, then you can make some adverse synapses and your brain will get worse, but you can't really make it better. So that was the prevailing thought. So fast forward to us in 2013 in the scanner in Auburn, and I've been trained in this. I've been practicing neuroscience and neurosurgery for all these years, and I believe that stuff. I just lost a son. I've been through this hard thing. I'm in this place where I believe that I've now been bereaved and broken in some way, and it's going to be really hard for my life to ever mean anything anymore or to really be happy again and all that stuff. In the context of being a Christian, so Christians are vulnerable to this too. So maybe someday God will come back and fix it all, but for now I'm hosed, I'm broken, I'm going to be sad. So that's where I was. So we watched the scan, and they say, okay, Mrs. Jones, stop thinking about that bad thing and start thinking about the best day ever. The day he proposed to you, the day that your first child was born, the day you won the lottery, or whatever it was. And all of a sudden, different parts of the brain start lighting up, and those scared and hurtful and fearful parts start calming down. And what we'd seen before was that when she was scared, her heart rate went up and her blood pressure went up and her vital signs all changed negatively. And now all that stuff was getting better because she was calming down. And so I just made this connection because I could see it happening on the screen. I made this connection that these people thought something that made their brain do something, and their brain made their body do something. And so it couldn't be true then that the brain was making the mind just making it up, because you could think about something and then your brain would structurally do something. And understand that when your brain does something, that means that genes are getting turned on or off. It means that neurotransmitters are getting produced and released. It means that hormones are getting stimulated in the pituitary gland, in the adrenal gland, change your physiology. So it means that literally on a structural level, when you choose to think about one thing and not another thing, you're changing the structure of your brain. And Lisa said, that's Philippians 4. That's when it says, don't be anxious, be grateful, and your heart will be guarded, and you'll feel better if you pray and you're thankful. And I started thinking about that, and I realized, wait a second. When I go to the operating room and I do brain surgery, I'm intentionally changing the structure of somebody's brain for the purpose of improving their life in some way, right? And when you think one thing and not another thing, you are intentionally changing the structure of your brain for the purpose of making yourself feel better in some way. That's surgery. And so when I say self-brain surgery, it's not a metaphor. It's a mechanism. It's the physical thing that happens in your brain when you choose to take charge of that process that's already happening, right? So God built us with this process of synapses that are constantly breaking and remaking. And the trick is we can change how they remake if we change how we think. So it's when you say change your thinking to change your drinking, like you're literally structurally making a pathway. And then there's this thing called neuroplasticity that Kurt Thompson and everybody writes about. And we metaphorically apply it to our lives, but I want you to understand it's not a metaphor. Like you are literally taking advantage of a process that God created of how you transform your mind when you choose to take your thoughts captive, right? You're no longer required to remake that synapse in the same way. And then there's a thing called Hebb's law. It says neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So when you choose to force your brain to make a new synapse, it within milliseconds makes that synapse. And if you keep reinforcing it with repeated behavior, then over time, the old synapses die off. And you structurally rewire your brain in a way that now is helping you instead of hurting you process this thing or feel this thing or not do that thing anymore or change that habit or recover from grief or whatever it turns out to be. You have literally performed surgery on your own brain. And when I saw that, I said, that's how you heal after you lose a son. Like that's how you move forward. That's how you stop drinking alcohol. That's how you quit numbing yourself from the things that hurt you so that you can make progress in your life. You take advantage of this process. And then I found Ephesians 4 is this long version. If 2 Corinthians 10:5 is your cliff note of, hey, you need to it's your prescription, right? Take your thoughts captive. Then Romans 12:2 is your Cliff's Notes version of what self-brain surgery is. Don't be conformed anymore. Don't let the world tell you that you're just your brain or you're stuck with the brain that you have. Don't let the world tell you that if you got the wrong Enneagram score or the wrong set of parents or the wrong set of genes or whatever, that you have to be this way. Don't let your identity be formed out of your things that have happened to you. Let that be insight for you, but don't let how you are become who you are anymore because you don't have to. So Romans 12:2 then is this cliff notes. It's don't be conformed, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you get to Ephesians 4, and it's like this war and peace version of what's happening. Because what it says is, hey, your business as a Christian, your business as a human is to become more like Christ over time. Okay? That's your job. And the problem is, in Ephesians 4:17, it says, the Gentiles, the people who haven't figured this out, the people who don't have their minds transformed, the problem is not a problem, but the problem, it says, is they are lost in the futility of their thinking. They're thinking about the wrong stuff, right? We think, I need a drink to make me happy. I need to divorce this person to make me happy. I need to take a new job and then I'll be happy. And what happens? The target keeps moving, right?
Yep.
You never feel happy when you finally get the thing because it's not the thing that ever had the inherent power to be able to make you happy. Because you're still there, right? If the problem is all internal. So we have this big lie from the enemy that says that we have an external locus of control. Everything outside of you is responsible for you being happy, or somebody else needs to change something so you can feel better, or some therapist needs to come along and write the right prescription for you. And don't hear me wrong. You need a therapist sometimes. You need a doctor sometimes. You need a medicine sometimes. But you can't think that person or that prescription inherently is what's going to fix you, because you can take all the Prozac you want to, and if you still think the same way, you're still going to be depressed. Right? You might not feel as depressed, but you still will be. So Ephesians 4, he says the problem with the unredeemed mind is the futility of their thinking. And then down in 23, I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's 4:23. He says, you though can be renewed in your mind. You're not stuck being who you were. You're not stuck being how you were. You're not stuck being all the stuff that happened to you, because you can renew your mind. And then he says over in 1 Corinthians that you have the mind of Christ. So the big insight I had, this actually, I'm giving away the plot to my new book that's coming out next year, Handbook of Self-Brain Surgery. The punchline is, if Jesus never sinned with his thinking, right? Because he tells you in the Sermon on the Mount that you don't have to murder somebody, you can just hate them. And that's the same thing. You don't have to sleep with somebody, you can just lust after them. That's the same thing, right? So your mind can cause trouble for you. That's what Jesus is trying to say. You don't have to do something, you can just think something and it can hurt you. And we know now that the neuroscience of that is you make the wrong synapses, you get a worse neurochemical environment in your brain. You epigenetically tag your genes, so your kids are born stressed out about stuff that they didn't never go through. We know that now. And we know you can fix it all through changing your thinking. So Jesus, if you think about it, if he never sinned with his mind, that means he never made his brain worse structurally with the things he thought about, right? He never injured his own brain. And we know now that when you think about stuff in the right way, your brain gets more resilient, your anterior cingulate gyrus gets better able at handling hard things and all this stuff. So he spent his entire life preparing for this massive moment when he was going to have to get, shamed and falsely accused and publicly beaten and crucified and all that stuff. And he knew it was coming. And he made himself go through it. So his mid-anterior cingulate was getting more robust and more able to handle hard things. The whole time he was going through his life, he was making his brain better able at handling that stuff, right? So then if he can make his brain better and we have the mind of Christ, that means if you decide to take on this job of being a self-brain surgeon, you can have a brain that looks more like his did.
So good.
That's the mic drop moment.
Yeah, I love it. So good. And there's so much hope in that. That's what I just find, because I was the person that was stuck in 2019 with I didn't even know that my thoughts were not me. I didn't know that they were separate from me. I didn't even know what my thoughts were. I just knew that I knew I had a voice that was telling me, accusing me, yelling at me, negatively speaking to me, all of those things. And I was just stuck. And it's so hopeful when we think about how by accessing our thinking and the way that the Lord designed our brains to work, that they can be changed. And it's not just, I love that you say, it's not just a metaphor. That's like also my drop for me. It's not just a metaphor. Love it.
No, it's real. It's structural. And you can see it on the scan. That's what turned my life around. Just watching that happen, it was amazing.
Imagine stepping into a vibrant, warm community where faith, friendship, and freedom from alcohol all come together. That's exactly what you'll experience in the But Jesus Drank Wine community.
Each week, our members gather for connection calls that feel like a breath of fresh air, a time to share, grow, and support one another.
With an encouraging leadership team, a dedicated prayer request space, and connection opportunities in every time zone, you don't have to walk this journey alone.
Plus, we bring you masterclasses with expert guests, optional book clubs and Bible studies, and so much more.
And for those ready to go even deeper, we offer a small group coaching space called The Missing Piece. With weekly recorded coaching calls, it's a supportive place for women committed to breaking free from alcohol.
We're here to hold space for sober and sober-curious women who love Jesus or are eager to reconnect with him. Wherever you are on your path, you'll feel seen, supported, and strengthened here.
As one member described, quote, "The BJDW community is unique because there's a connection between faith and freedom from alcohol that I haven't been able to find in any other online space or through my church."
Ready to join the sisterhood? Head over to butjesusdrankwine.com/community or click the link in the show notes to learn more. We can't wait to meet you. I love how you talk about, because my story was numbing because of grief as well, and only figured all of this out after. But I love how you speak, Dr. Lee, about having a treatment plan before, right?
Yeah.
So can you expand on a little bit on that? Like, how do people prepare themselves? Because we're all going to go through really hard things.
That's
And
right.
if you haven't experienced anything yet, it's coming.
Yeah, so the whole treatment plan idea came out of me recognizing that we spend a lot of time preparing for stuff that's not likely to happen. Like, for example, like you both went to school in the United States, right? I know you're in the UK right now, Christy, but you went to school in the US, and every kid in the United States, at least in our age groups, has a plan for what they're going to do if they catch on fire. Right? What do you do?
Stop, drop, and roll.
Stop, drop, and roll.
You were taught that a million times. I was surprised at how many times I didn't catch on fire because of him. You have a plan for what you're going to do if you have a flat tire. You have a plan for what you're going to do if somebody has a heart attack. You're going to grab the defibrillator. You have a plan for if your child has an allergy attack. You have an EpiPen. You have a plan. But we all go through traumatic, adverse emotional experiences, and most of us never prepare for them. We just walk into them, and then we get blown away. Then we blame God, and we're mad, and we're stressed out, and we're drinking, and we're doing something because we weren't ready. And so you say, don't be morbid and expect bad things to happen in your life and all that stuff. So you shouldn't be worried about that thing. But guess what? Everybody goes through these massive things. There's 2 places in the New Testament specifically. Jesus said, John 16:33, in this world, you're going to have trouble, right? And I've overcome the world. John 10:10, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Like, you got an enemy that's after you, and he's going to hurt you, and bad stuff's going to happen in your life, and you better be ready for it. And I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. So that means that, I'm a super nerd, so forgive me for this, but
I love it.
I found something in quantum physics that made me be able to see the hope in John 10:10. And it was this idea in quantum physics that 2 things can be true at the same time. So they did all these experiments on electrons. And electrons sometimes behave like particles, like you just have a little thing that's an electron, and it just goes one place and does a thing. You can grab it and look at it, and it's a particle. Sometimes it acts like a wave, like it's a wave on the ocean, and you can't actually grab it or measure it easily. It's moving around like a wave. And they found out that how you set the experiment up turns out to determine whether the electron behaves like a wave or a particle. So if you set the experiment up to see if it's a particle, it always looks like a particle. If you set the experiment up to see if it behaves like a wave, it always behaves like a wave. So what they figured out is the observer impacts the outcome of the experiment. So that's the whole rub with quantum physics. Like, your attention to something turns it into what it turns out to be. So how you look at it affects the reality of it. Okay. So if that happens, 2 things can be true at the same time, and how you attend to them makes one more real or the other. Then Jesus says, hey, you got an enemy that wants to steal and kill and destroy your life. And I've come that you might have abundance and have a life that means something and matters and can still be purpose-filled and happy, even in the midst of all that steal, kill, and destroy. What he didn't say is, I came so that all that stuff will go away in your life and you'll never have steal, kill, and destroy again. He didn't say, I came to give you abundance someday in heaven, 100 years from now, but right now it's going to really suck for you. He didn't say that. Sorry if I said that. What he said is, your life is going to be hard and it can be abundant at the same time. Okay. So for me, it was like, okay, I lost my son, and I'm never going to stop being sad about that. And it's never going to stop being the worst thing that ever happened. And my wife and I are always going to be broken. I know that when I'm 90 years old, I'm going to be sad that he's not going to be at my funeral. I know that, right? But at the same time, he allowed me to see, and I'll tell you, I don't know if you've read, I know you read Hope is the First Dose. Our granddaughter, Scarlett, was born on the day we buried our son, our first grandchild. So we had all this jumbled up stuff happening, right? We had all this joy. We all had plane tickets to go and be with our daughter, Katie, in San Antonio when the baby was born. And instead, we're in Alabama burying Mitch. And she's in Texas delivering her first baby and not at her brother's funeral. And it was horrible. And it was tragic. And it was just terrible. But at the same time, we're sitting in the funeral and we're getting texts with pictures of our first granddaughter being. And it was beautiful. And it was hope. And it was a little bit of light. And it was 2 things being true at the same time. And it was, the thief stole this thing from us. And he killed us and he destroyed us. But Jesus is giving us abundance at the same time. And so if you can find a way, friend, if you can find a way to let your life hurt you and let your loss, Christy, your pain, make you choose bad things and all of that stuff. And then you can remember, wait, it's not all of this thing. There's also some beauty and there's also some light. And if you can hold that stuff in both hands or in the same hand and let them both be true, then you can start to see that this thing can't define me now. Like it can refine me. It can make things better for me. It can help me find a way to move forward and give me some purpose, maybe, or give me some new realities in my life that I didn't know about that are going to turn out to be important to me, like writing. I never saw that coming. But it never stops being true that you're hurting, but it also now can also be true that you still have abundance. And that reminds me of Viktor Frankl. When he was in the concentration camp and his wife and his family were killed, and he was the only one that survived. And if you read Man's Search for Meaning, he said two things. One, suffering stops being suffering when you find purpose in it, or when you find meaning. You can redefine it as meaning or purpose. But he also said two things true at the same time. Man's mind can make the gas chambers at Auschwitz, but they can also decide to walk into that gas chamber with the Shema Yisrael or the Lord's Prayer on their lips. So you can say, you know what, dude, this life really hurts and it's hard, it's horrible, but I can have an abundant life anyway. And then the gospel economy, the trick of Jesus that's so amazing is sometimes it's beautiful, more beautiful because of the suffering that we've been through. That's what Isaiah meant when he said, God said to Isaiah, I've refined you in the furnace of suffering. So you can be burned up to a crisp and destroyed by it, or you can come out of it on the other side with some stuff about you that's more pure and more refined and more passionate and more hopeful and more faithful and more helpful to other people than you ever thought would be possible if you hadn't gone through that hard. And so this is a very long answer to your simple question. But the bottom line is it turns out that if you don't have a treatment plan in place, you're going to take a very long time to get to that place where those two things can be true at the same time. And you're going to be vulnerable to being destroyed by the furnace of suffering instead of refined by it. But if you have a treatment plan in place, then you're going to say, hey, no, enemy, I know what you're trying to do. Not today. I know you're trying to destroy me and it is going to hurt me, but I know what's true at the same time. I know that this is not the only thing. I know that voice you're telling me my whole life is defined by this thing. Now, that's not true. And I don't have to run that play. And so the treatment plan is that prehab of having put all that true stuff in your heart, knowing some things that are true that you're going to be able to fall back on when you're suffering, that are going to hold up, that the floor's not going to collapse underneath you. Mark Vroegop, if you haven't read Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, he's the best book on lament that I've ever read. He wrote this line, there's a floor to your suffering that Jesus bought with his blood. Like you can't fall beyond that. If you buy into that, there's a limit to how far you can fall, right? And then you can put your feet down and that floor is going to hold. And so when you have a treatment plan in place, you say, you know what? This is really terrible that I'm going through, but I'm going to put my foot down on something that's going to hold me up because I know some things that are true. And so prehab is that putting that true stuff in your heart so you have it to grab onto when you need it, to know I'm going to reach in this pocket and there's something in there that's going to help me. And if you don't have the word inside you, if you don't have the words inside you that you can call back, then you really are struggling because you don't know what's true and you don't know where you can turn, right? And so then the self-brain surgery is the second piece of it, like having some things that you can do that will hold up and help you get better. So like this idea that I'm not stuck with the brain that I have. I can't be broken in a fundamental way because I can change my brain by thinking differently. I can refine my thinking and redeem my thinking. I have the mind of Christ available to me. I know that my neurotransmitters will reliably respond when I choose gratitude instead of anxiety. I know that stuff, that neuroscience is going to work when I need it to work because of how fearfully and wonderfully made I am. I know that's going to work for me. And so I'm going to run those plays. I'm going to do what I need to do and reach out for professional help if I need to, but I'm going to take charge of this thing. I'm not going to let it take charge of me. So you've got this plan in place where you're going to run that play. And the last piece, it will relate to you guys in the community of recovery because the last piece is rehab, and rehab requires a team, people that are going to come alongside you, help you and have community and accountability with you to hold you up and say, hey, no, don't forget what's true. I know you're hearing that right now in your head. I know you're hurting in your heart, but remember these true things. Remember that your brain will respond if you command it properly with your control center of your mind. Remember that your stuff that you're afraid of that you got from your mom and dad or from that thing that happened when you were 10 years old, that you don't have to live there anymore because you can change today and your synapses will improve. You're going to get better. And you need some people in your life who will call you out and hold you up at the same time. That's the plan.
Amen.
Amen. How do people live without the Bible? That's what I'm saying this whole time.
Same here.
I really don't know. But I think we need to say a word. I don't know if all
Yep.
of your listeners are Christians or not. I don't know. But if you're not a believer out there,
Yeah.
here's some good news for you. So Christians recognize that God, there's a scripture, in fact, the sun shines on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on the believers and the non-believers. Like God has given some general grace and some general principles that will hold true. And you can use science to improve your life, even if you don't believe in God. There's a path where you can make things better by using self-directed neuroplasticity, as the scientists would call it. You can make your life better. What I believe is if you do that there's still going to be some things that happen in your life because science can't answer everything. There's still going to be some moments when you say, look how incredible this system works. And look how amazing it is that it just evolved this way. It just turned out to be this way. And you're going to start wondering, how in the world could something like this have come from the nothingness of empty space? And somehow all these things blew up and collapsed together, and all this fine tuning happened in the universe. And I happened to be born at just this place with a brain that would respond to my thinking. And maybe if you follow that trail of science, then maybe you'll get to some place where you start asking some other questions. And when you do, reach out to me and Christy and say, hey, I want to know more about this faith stuff that you're talking about, because science can't answer everything.
Yeah.
But just as an aside, let me tell you a story you might not have ever heard. The Cambridge Physics Laboratory at Cambridge University, the Cavendish Physics Laboratory at Cambridge University, was founded by a guy named John Clerk Maxwell, who was the scientist that figured out that electromagnetism and electricity were the same thing, and light were all the same, various forms of the same thing. His work led to Einstein's work in special relativity that gave us quantum physics and gave us smartphones and Riverside and these things that we're using today. All of that. Maxwell was the guy that started all that work, and he was a Christian. And it turns out that Newton and Copernicus and Kepler and all the big names in science were Christians. And what they thought science was for seeking out explanations to the things that God had done for the purpose of helping people believe in. So when you hear people say that science and faith don't coexist, the truth is science was founded by faithful people as a way to explore what God has done in the world. And at the Cavendish Lab to this day in Cambridge, over the entryway in the door frame are the verses from Psalms 111 that says, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all those who delight in it. So every time Watson and Crick, which, by the way, that's the lab where Watson and Crick discovered DNA, okay? Every time they walked through that door in their materialistic, atheistic mind frame, they walked under the words of Scripture. It says, when you figure stuff out scientifically, you're doing it because I gave you a mind to want it. Pondering the works of the Lord. So science and faith don't collapse. They help each other.
So good. That's so good.
Isn't that cool?
It's so cool. It's so cool because I definitely got to that place of finding freedom from alcohol more from a science-based place first, because I wasn't in right relationship with the Lord at that time. And then it was like finding freedom from alcohol created this space for this return home to the Lord and a new relationship. And that's when it was like, wait a minute, but now these don't fit together. Like I know they fit together, but I don't know how they fit together. And so I actually did it the way without Jesus for a long time. And I could make some little, I love that you point that out, because I could make some improvements in my life by the psychology of things and knowing that. But my life was not abundant and full until Jesus was part of it afterwards. And so that's so good. I want to get to, we threw out, since we have so many fangirls in our community, fangirls with Dr. Lee Warren, we asked what they would want to ask if they were sitting here chatting with you today. And so we just have a few questions that we'd love to throw at you, rapid fire. One of our members asked, what are the effects of alcohol on and this is one of those, we don't have all day for this, but maybe you can give us a little tidbit here. The effects of alcohol on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.
I would just say, again, we don't have 4 hours, but The bottom line is there is not a single system in your body that is not harmed by alcohol. Like every single aspect of your body is injured by alcohol. Alcohol is a class 1 neurotoxin. I'll tell you a quick little funny story. There was a time when I was a resident training in neurosurgery, and we're performing brain surgery, and sometimes they use isopropyl alcohol to clean instruments, or if there's like an instrument that's bloody or something, the scrub tech will get some alcohol and rub it. And the scrub tech brought some alcohol up onto the Mayo stand, this little stand that we keep all our instruments on, and it was close to the brain. And the attending surgeon freaked out. Get that alcohol away from this field, because if it pours on the brain, it will kill all these neurons, it will hurt the patient. And get that out of here. It shouldn't be here. So the neurosurgeon freaking out about the possibility of alcohol touching the brain, right? Then 3 hours later, we had a visiting professor. We had a meeting and a dinner downtown in Pittsburgh, and the same professor was there getting blitzed on some martinis. I kid you not. So I just saw this happen, and I said, wait a minute. 3 hours ago, you're telling the scrub tech not to get alcohol in the brain. Now you're putting alcohol in your bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barriers, converted to acetaldehyde, which is directly toxic to neurons more than isopropyl alcohol is, and you're going to put it directly into your brain. Isn't that the same kind of problem? Like you're saying, alcohol is directly harmful to nervous system tissue, but you don't think about that when you're consuming it, right? So that's a funny story to me of how weird we can get with our thoughts. But in terms of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, basically your ability to be resilient and make good decisions and have your physiology respond determines your sort of resilience of how well your autonomic nervous system behaves, right? So if your autonomic nervous system isn't behaving very well, then you're going to be easily stressed, high cortisol, freaking out state, more easily triggered into fight, flight, fear, and all that stuff, and more difficulty shifting into rest and digest and parasympathetic type stuff. So when you give your brain a toxin that makes it not communicate very well to the parts of your brain that are involved in resilience and quiet and executive control and better decision making, you are going to injure and harm your ability to shift into a more nutritive, restful, healing state. So that'd be the short answer.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And I love the way that you explained it, because how we try to explain it is just not technically, because we don't have the training. So thank you. Another question was, how does alcohol affect our pain response?
That's a good question. So first of all, you have numbing of your cerebral cortex, right? So you have this immediate calming effect that you get when you drink alcohol. And that's because you release GABA, this neurotransmitter that's related to pain and all that. So it seems like on the front end of the transaction that you're making things feel better. What happens the next day is all your neurons are depleted and can't release GABA when you need it. And you get too much of other harmful neurotransmitters, especially dynorphin and others, that basically make it where the things that were hurting you before feel more prominent now, because your neurotransmitter balance is out and you don't have a proper amount of the things that you normally release when you're hurting someone, just emotionally, but physically, right? So you have blunted your body's intrinsic ability to make things feel better when you need to. And then that will trigger, because the dopamine reward cycle that gets off balance too, that's going to trigger a thought in your mind that what the solution is, that alcohol will be the fix for the thing that's hurting you. And that feeds back into why it's so addictive, right? So you basically shoot yourself in the foot and make your chemistry off so that alcohol is what's causing you to hurt more. And your brain makes you think that alcohol is the solution to making that feel better. So I think that's probably the best answer I could give you.
That's so good. It's the temporary. It's how we get stuck with the stories that say do this in those moments of pain, but then we're stuck with, as you would call it, like the tomorrow problem. It's going to be a lot worse. Thank you. That's so good. This other question was from your 10 commandments, which if anybody's not listening to your podcast, I highly recommend your latest episode, the spiritual brain surgery one, where you're summarizing the 10 commandments, and it's so good. All of it's so good. But one of our community members, she said, so I practice this all the, like, must relentlessly refuse to participate in my own demise. That's commandment 1.
Yeah.
Yep. And so I got that,
but then I continued to participate in my own demise. She was like, "Oh, how do I stop that? How do I get that to shift?"
I think that's the no self malpractice commandment, basically. Quit doing stuff that hurts you, right? Quit doing things that are harmful to you. And that we all do it all the time. All of us do.
Mhm.
I think tying it back to the ninth commandment that I give you, which is what I'm doing, I'm getting better at. I think that's important on a neuroscience level because, as we talked about earlier with neuroplasticity, when you make a synapse, the more times you run that same play, the more ingrained and automated that synapse is, and the less mental energy you have to spend to run that same play again. So the bottom line there is that's why we drink sometimes a half a bottle of wine before we realize we're drinking a half bottle of wine. It's because that's a habit. Certain time of day, we
Yep.
put on our pajamas and turn Netflix on and open the glass and open a bottle. And then all of a sudden, we got a bag of Cheetos and a half a bottle of wine. And we met, oh, this is the day I was going to start that keto diet and drink it. Because we forgot that we.
Did you read my journal?
Right, I did. I read your journal. No, so the bottom line is that when you do something, you get better neurologically at doing that thing. Your brain's entire job, other than keeping you alive, your brain's entire job is to ask you permission to automate things, so that you don't have to think about them as much. So if you have this consent to automate, your brain says, "Hey, last time you felt this thing, the last time somebody said that to you, or you went through this hard thing, you told me to respond to that by drinking alcohol. You want me to do that again?" You say, "Yep, I want to do that again." So then the next time it's, "Hey, you want to drink again?" "Yep." And then the next time is, "I don't even think about it. I'm just drinking." So the way you break out of that is to remind yourself that you have this creative power. And remember, I told you earlier that observing something, you have the power to change the reality about how you choose to pay attention to it and observe it. So if you say, "I want my reality to be different than it has been," that means if I want something to be different, I've got to be different. So if I keep doing the same thing, I'm going to keep getting the same thing, right? So what got me here won't get me there if there needs to be different than here is. So what I have to do then is I have to make some strategic decisions to reinforce the habit that I want to have come true in my life, the new thing that I want to be true. And so in terms of drinking, for example, then number one would be, there's an old comedian when I was a kid, black guy named Flip Wilson.
Yeah.
Flip Wilson was hilarious. And his famous line was, "The devil made me do it." You know? And the devil doesn't, he might tempt you to drink, but if you went to the store and bought it and it's in your cabinet and tonight you drink it, you can't blame the devil for that because it was in your house, right? So the way to break the habit is to set things up in your life, build a system where it's harder to do the thing you're trying to stop doing than it is to do the new thing that you want to do, right? Most of us aren't going to dramatically go out of our way to reinforce a bad habit if it's harder to do that than it is to do the thing that we're trying to set up in front of us. In terms of how do you stop committing self-malpractice, the first one is really trust Dr. Warren when he says you're going to get better at what you're doing. So if you want this new thing to come true, practice the new thing a bunch, write it down, have somebody call you at a certain time of day and say, "Hey, remember 5 minutes from now is when you usually do that thing. Don't do that thing. Do this other thing." So just set some practices up, set some alarms on your phone to remind you. Put a scripture or a copy of the 10 Commandments in the drawer where your corkscrew is, or whatever it is that you need. You got to now make a mental decision to change, to violate that commandment. You got to do it on purpose now. You have a little reminder, and you're going to start building these synapses and making these habits. And before long, your brain's going to start asking you those consent questions again. "Hey, you've been lately telling me not to do that thing. Do you want me not to do that thing again?" And you'll say, "Yeah, don't do that thing again." And then before you know it, the default will be that you don't do that thing anymore. Now it's less likely that you're going to have that problem again because you've built a new habit. You've gotten better at what you're doing. And that's the answer.
Nothing changes if nothing changes, right? I love that idea. But did you say put the Bible where the corkscrew would be? Is that what you said?
Yeah, or
I love
scripture,
that.
or
Yeah.
anything. You put something else there.
I
to
love
say,
that.
I made a contract with myself, and now I'm going to have to break that contract. Like physically, there's a piece of paper that, "Hey, you made a contract." Like I'm going to have to do something to get engaged with that old habit again.
Yeah. And for our gals listening, do all those things in the morning before it gets too late in the afternoon. Yeah, sorry, Mead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it just reminds me of how Pastor David the other day said with temptation, nothing kills temptation more than speaking scripture out loud in the moment of temptation. And yeah, there's so much power to that. So good. Okay, the last one, but this is we're not going to have time for, but the link between alcohol and dementia. That's one of our.
To me, it's just like
Okay.
there's at least seven cancers that are definitely related to alcohol that happen much less likely in people that don't drink alcohol. Dementia is true too. Alzheimer's, particularly, and other forms of frontal lobe dementia, is dramatically more common in people that drink alcohol than those who don't. And so even the people that have the gene that predisposes for alcohol predisposes for dementia, don't get dementia as much if they don't drink. Alcohol directly contributes to neuronal loss. Neuronal volume is the number one thing that keeps you from getting dementia. So every time you drink, you're killing brain cells and you're going to need them later in your life. So alcohol directly related to dementia. Not the only cause, but a direct, definitely contributor.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so good. Christy, anything?
No, I was just going to say, I feel let's end on why hope is the first dose, because I feel like we also hear this a lot, right? Like, I can't change. There's no way. I'm never going to get there. And so can you just remind us why that's so important?
Absolutely. So you can have the best plan in the world, and you can have all the science, and you can have all the facts and all the scripture and everything else. But hope is defined by the sociologists as the belief that you can get there from here. Okay. And if you don't believe that you can get there from here, and if you take a scripture like Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. If you put a filter in that, and when you say it or when you read it, you say, everybody else but me can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But I went through this adverse childhood experience, and you don't know what I've been through, and nobody should expect me because I'm Enneagram 6 or whatever. Like I am neurodiverse, so I can't do all things through Christ. If you have some filter, that verse isn't going to come true for you, then you don't have hope that it can come true for you. And so hope is the first dose, because you can't make progress in your life, regardless of the toolkit or the team or the people or the opportunity, if you don't really believe that it's true or that it's possible. So in a biblical sense, I would say faith is the belief that God can do the things that he says he can do. And hope is the belief that he will do those things for me. And if you don't believe that, no amount of podcast listening or exercise or therapy or AA meetings or anything else will get you to the place where hope is possible, where progress is possible for you, because you won't get engaged with the practice. You won't get engaged with the plan. And I always say to people, like when I talk about self-brain surgery, don't put it all on yourself. Okay. God made your brain. God made your mind. God made all these processes, all these abilities that you have to connect all these dots and make these things happen. Only thing you required of you is the consent. If I decide to operate on you, offer you surgery to save your life, and you don't show up at the hospital, I can't fix you. You got to come. But that's all you have to do. We'll do the rest. Like God will take care of it, but you got to show up, and that requires hope.
Yeah.
So good.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think this might be my favorite episode ever.
Thank you.
I was fighting. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I was like on the verge of crying and trying to focus. And yeah. Oh, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and the blessing that you have been to our audience. We are so grateful for you and the work you're doing in the world.
It's been a real pleasure, and I'm grateful for the work that y'all are doing, and it's really you're making a difference in a lot of people's lives, and I'm happy to be connected, and thank you.
We will link all of the books that we mentioned and your newsletter and everything in the show notes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And Substack, if y'all are not on the Substack, get on the Substack. It's so good.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much for joining us again this week. You can find all of our episodes at butjesusdrinkwine.com, and be sure to follow us over on Instagram, Love Life Sober, and I'm Not Sober, I'm Free.
To learn more about what we do, you can visit our websites, meethollandshirley.com and lovelifesober.com.
Take a screenshot of this podcast and share it with a friend or two.
And don't forget to subscribe to our pod so you don't have to worry about missing a single episode. And if you love what we're doing, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify.
This helps more women who are feeling stuck and alone in the overdrinking cycle find hope and encouragement.
Thanks, ladies. We so appreciate you, and we'll see you next Monday.